Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 258, and we're going to talk about Dave Smith talking about Neil Degrasse Tyson. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Mine was quite enjoyable, good family time. My mom had a good time, so that was pretty cool. Let's see. I wanted to get this episode out of the way. I'm still feeling kind of under the weather, and I wanted to pretty much rest most of the day. But there's an episode where part of the problem, Dave Smith with Robbie Bernstein, where they're talking about trusting the science. And so they're discussing an interview that Bill Maher had with Degrasse Tyson, who I got to admit I saw for the first time in Elegant Universe. I had read the book first. I think I had to read it for class because I had to teach it. And then I found that there was you know, a video version of the book. And so, of course, I shared that with everybody. And there Neil Tyson was, right, being the narrator through this. And I thought he was a quite intelligent person. But then, of course, as with most people who get full of themselves, he started leaving his lane and just elevating his own personal opinions as scientific information. And so people like that. And so the interview, if you watch the episode or the interaction between Bill Maher and Neil Degrasse Tyson is really interesting. So Bill Maher is just simply pointing out some truths, some basic truths, uh, or subjective truths, shall we say, where the an editor of Scientific American said some very unscientific things. And I think DeGrasse Tyson started trying to defend Scientific American. And I think that's sort of the angle that he decided that he was going to take to try to defend his field and his position. And one thing that you have to realize is that when you think that you are the smartest person in the room, like Tyson obviously does, you cannot admit being wrong ever, right? You can't. Because as soon as you do that, that you're wrong, then there are more occasions you might be wrong. There are other situations where, you got it wrong. And so you now have to admit that you can be wrong lots of times. And so you can't give that inch. It's that slippery slope problem, right? And so you're going to do a dance. You're going to try to do everything you can to avoid admitting that you were wrong. And so, in other words, he picks a hill where he's going to die. And Dave Smith said that he was basically backing the establishment. And so, again, at some point, he starts ranting. He says, I'm a scientist, which I thought was hilarious, right? I'm a scientist. I'm never wrong, or I'm smarter than you, which is so arrogant. And I've met lots of people like that. And it's just simply the wrong move. I've talked about that, the arrogance of experts, the arrogance of people with narrow subjectivities, and how that's where they get tripped up. That's how they go wrong, is because they believe that they can't be wrong, that their subjectivity is absolute. Everyone must see things their way. And if they do, they're always right, no matter how wrong they are. I've been wanting to talk about Neil Tyson for a while, and I'll just do it through this episode. But one thing that he does not seem to understand, but I have said in every single one of my classes, that science has become politicized. It's just more obvious now, where science was sort of hidden from view of the public, right? Because you didn't know what they were researching, you didn't know what the government was funding. And now all of a sudden, especially because of the surveillance, now you see that they were funding gain of function research and all this other kind of nonsense with taxpayer dollars, right? You already know, I'm sure, that there are like 12 biolabs in Ukraine and all this other nonsense. But anyway, and so, the politicization of science is now just more open. More people can see it now. And the fact that they were yelling, trust the science, and all of it was wrong, just sort of creates the necessary suspicion that people should have when it comes to government funded scientific endeavors. So, an editor of Scientific American said some very unscientific things. And Bill Maher just floats that out to Degrasse Tyson to see what he has to say. And of course, he deflects, right? He starts engaging in whataboutism, which I've talked about before, right? So he said, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And so it's a kind of deflection. It's a change the subject kind of strategy that a lot of people who realize that they are on a weak leg, right? They're going to shift the rules of the dialogue to something else where they're stronger and therefore not have to get an L or a loss in that discussion. And so Bill Maher says, engage with the idea. And of course, he still doesn't. He says, well, does she still have a job there, right? And so basically, she's tweeted, X'd some unscientific things about women and men in sports, that it's more not the result of biology, but because of, uh, you know, what do you call it, misogyny in society, which is why women are not competing directly against men. And so uh, Tyson goes, oh, but in long distance swimming, women are probably better. Okay, but what about everything else? What about everything that you have been discussing? And it's this kind of thing where he's like, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And so he's trying to come up with exceptions to the generally known principle, right? And what we're watching here is, of course, it's a dynamic of whataboutism or changing the subjectism so that he doesn't have to admit that he got something wrong. But what you're seeing is the mixing of ideology and science. And I think Dave Smith points that out as well, where you are going to pick something that you believe is absolutely true, and then you're going to say it's scientific. And what I've talked about this before, it's when morality interferes with your subjectivity, right? Your own personal belief, that AKA religion, your own personal belief interferes with what you see, what you decide is important and what is not important, what you're going to regard as legitimate data versus irrelevant data, right? So all of that subjectivity, pushes you down a certain road, which simply validates what you already believe is true. And I pointed this out with the whole scientific method, how it's so interesting. When I first was taught it from the very beginning, I thought it was kind of silly because you get to dictate the parameters of the experiment. And of course, you're going to craft it in such a way that you're going to get the desired results, thereby proving your hypothesis. And I guess, science, because been they have seen this already. They put on these other rules, but it doesn't matter because you can still do that no matter how complex you may and how thick the book is and the manual is on how to conduct an objective experiment. You can still figure out a way to sort of sort of goose the data one way or the other. All right, so what's interesting is that Dave Smith, so that's the Degrasse Tyson problem. But then from that discussion, Dave Smith then talks about logic and emotion, which is basically what Tyson has a problem with, right? So he realizes that he's wrong, and instead of responding with reason, with logic, he responds with emotion, and therefore engages in that deflection, whataboutism thing. But Dave Smith gives an example I thought was kind of interesting where he talks about marriage. And he says that men, generally speaking, are more logical than women. Women are generally more emotional. And if you listen to my Sunday sermons, and I think I did an episode recently about emotion, but emotion, while, yeah, okay, yeah, it's valid in the sense that people feel it, it's real, there it is, and it is, somewhat important to know how certain things affect how we feel. We always have to keep in mind that emotion is the absence of knowledge, right? You feel things, regardless of what just happened, you feel something. Whether it's real or not real, it doesn't really, it depends. So sometimes some feelings, like the response mourning and then reacting in a certain way, those emotions, yeah, I can see that they are real and they are important to acknowledge, sure. But then he goes into an argument with your girl. So logically, I'm right. And the girl says, I'm hurt by that. And I'm surprised Robbie didn't say anything at that moment. But think about that. You're in an argument. You realize that you're right, that your girl, as he puts it, is holding an untenable position. And she has to admit, yeah, you're right. But I'm hurt by that. Hurt by what? Hurt by the fact that you're right, and now I have to admit that I'm wrong. And then Dave Smith says, you didn't win, right? So you would logically, you won that argument, but you didn't win, right? Uh, so he says there are things that are true, but you'd be a penis to say it, right? You'd be a jerk to say that it's true. Yeah, I can understand that in certain situations there are certain rules of etiquette, of manners, which would prevent you from saying certain things. But if you are in an intimate relationship, then you have to say certain things. You cannot let those things go unsaid. And then he goes on to say that progressivism leans heavily into the emotion and how things make you feel, right? And so he goes on, but he kind of glosses over. He doesn't go back to the argument with your girl thing, and that's where I want to pick that bone with him. But then he goes into the race is a social construct thing, which I think I've talked about before, but he kind of trashes it. I think it's more that people who want to say it actually misunderstand what it actually means. And people just basically take a bad understanding of that expression. Race is a social construct, right? They take a bad understanding of that, and then they try to make policy based on it, or they try to therefore turn around and then start making claims about this or that race dynamics, which is a contradiction and a load of hypocrisy anyway. But that's for another episode. So here's where I have a problem. Okay, so personal morality interfering with your judgment, and so this is not just Tyson, but it's also Dave Smith as well, where their personal morality, where they have decided to decide things interferes with their judgment. So you can be stubborn about anything that you believe. That's your choice, right? But you can't impose it on everybody else. And this is why Bill Maher sometimes get things right? Because there are certain things that he will defend tooth and nail, right? Even a stopped clock is right twice a day. And so that's the thing. So he goes and picks and chooses certain positions that he's going to take on certain issues. And so sometimes he's right and sometimes he's wrong. Now, you resolve that, I've said before, by having a principle, my principle being no coercion, no hypocrisy. And so if whatever you're doing is hypocritical, you can maintain it on a personal level, but you can't make it the standard of justice because it is straight up injustice. If you're going to use force, right, unless you're a parent with a child who is about to do something life-threatening and dangerous, right, generally you're not going to engage in coercion with total strangers, right? You'll try to persuade them. And as soon as you do engage in coercion, and even if you do coercion in your own family, there's a risk, right, that people will respond badly to it. Okay. And so this is why sometimes personal morality resonates with people, and more often than not, it does not. It, you know, upsets other people, right? And so personal morality is basically your personal understanding of your religion. And so whenever you vocalize and share what you think is morally right or wrong, it's hit or miss, right? Some other people will agree with you, most people will disagree, which is why, it's very, very hard ever to get any kind of consensus about much of anything. Everyone has their own personal understanding, personal subjectivity of pretty much everything. The next thing, feelings. Feelings are a monster. I mean, once you start getting into the feels, the emotion, it's pretty much unstoppable. Like there's very little ability of the average human being, especially because they don't understand their feelings, to be able to fight those feelings, right? Most people, 99% of the time, 99% of the people, 99% of the time will give in to their emotions, right? If we were talking in church, then you would know that this is what most people would understand to be temptation. Another way of looking at it is addiction, right? What drives addiction? You might call it various hormones in the body, whatever. It's feeling, okay? It's not intellectual, right? Because if you were being intellectual, you would stop your behavior, but you cannot, right? And so that drive of feeling, yeah, it's like an addiction. And then also consider the male's feelings about the feelings of a woman. I'm not talking about how a man feels versus how a woman. No, no, I'm talking about how most men will respond to, I'm hurt by that. Right, right. So when you hear someone that you really want to get busy with, they say, I'm hurt by that. What are you going to say? Right. And so what am I talking about? Yes, it's manipulation. Right. So what people don't really seem to understand is that feelings can also be weaponized in a way to get what you want. And so, yeah, I'm married. Okay. Yeah, I'm married. Let's see, how many years? 26 years and going on 27. And the first 3 months of marriage was pretty crazy, right? Because I had to try to, well, and just FYI, full disclosure, I didn't know her. I knew her for, let's see, 3 months before we got engaged. And then 3 months later, we got married, right? So it was a very, very fast thing. And I was old. I was really old. She was older. She won't, she hates when I say that. But anyway, she was 4 years younger than me, but we were both getting up there in years and we wanted children. And so we had to, like, okay, we're pretty sure. So why beat around the bush? Let's get married and, start having family. So anyway, but trying to get on the same page when it comes to making decisions and how we move forward, that was pretty crazy. Okay. And the way that we overcame it is because I kept appealing to what we both acknowledged was right. Right. And I'm not saying that it would have been right for anybody else. Obviously, I don't think it would be, but it's not what I believed was true and therefore trying to get her to submit to it, but it's something that both of us acknowledged was true. And you can't get away from that. And that's how we were able to do it. In other words, we had to fight the emotions, right? Because there are a lot of emotions going on, and just looking at biology, when a lot of women, certain times of the month, emotions go haywire. And now I'm not saying that it should be ignored, but at the same time, you can't all of a sudden acknowledge certain things that were wrong as being right, right? It's always got to be the same. That's how justice works. And so we're going to look at the whole emotion versus logic. Again, remember, emotion, there's no knowledge. And in logic, there's all knowledge and reason, no emotion, right? And so everyone, according to your own subjectivity, you have to figure out where that line is going to be, right? You have the more you lack knowledge and information about something, the only thing you have is emotion, right? And so the more knowledge you have and assume perfect knowledge, then you're not going to respond to the emotion because you realize that sometimes emotions lie. Emotions deceive, emotions trick us. And so the only thing that we have to protect us from our emotions, which, as I said, were often in a monster, is our knowledge and our discipline, right? And our ability to control ourselves, right? And that's part of what becoming an adult is all about. Not living by our emotions, but living by the information, the knowledge, and understanding that we have accumulated over our life. And so, I heard this recently. Do women ever admit that they're wrong? right? And I threw this out to my eighth grade class because there are a lot of girls in there, and they all just started laughing. And the one girl who said that she does admit that she's wrong is being raised by her father, right? And so there is no mom in the picture. And so, of course, if the only adult in the room is your father, then you're going to be taught how to say you're wrong. Otherwise, there's a lot of manipulation that goes on. And so I think what Dave is, either choosing not to see or is weak to is that a manipulation which comes from the females that he loves very much. And there's all this whataboutism, right? So understand that if you're talking about something really important, whataboutism is not an argument, right? Either going into linguistics, as Robbie talked about, or any grasping at any straw just so that you don't lose. Now you're leaving the topic, you're not talking about it anymore, you're just trying not to lose and get your way. So this probably goes back to the way people are raised. People generally feel sorry for girls when they cry, but not so much for boys, maybe. And so people are generally socialized to give in to the manipulations of women, of girls. And you can see it when you teach middle schoolers. They're constantly trying to manipulate you, to cut you a break, to not penalize you for their test or their homework, and you know, so they function on a certain level. And then college girls, a lot of them do it too. And then, of course, when you get married, it doesn't stop there. So I wonder if it's a socialized, sort of biologically socialized kind of thing. So why is this an issue? Why am I making this an episode? And why is this episode going a little bit longer? Well, it is an issue because that's how voting and politics, is so skewed today, right? Because there's not a lot of information. There's not a lot of hard evidence. It's a lot of emotion, right? And that's all the left has. And a lot of people on the right, that's all they have is emotion. So not knowledge, not understanding, but how they feel, what they believe is morally true. And so therefore they have to die on that hill. So emotion and the desire for payback prohibits people from admission of being wrong or to consider anything else. So people are generally loyal to an interpretation or to gender roles or who has to be the stronger person or the perception of strong or weak or whatever. So everyone has to figure out how you're going to get by. For my part, consistency was the only way I was going to survive mentally. Just the way my brain works. My dad too, except my dad wasn't gracious in his way, and I learned from him. And so I tried to basically, assert that uh, the logical reason aspect of an argument while also considering and giving a nod to the emotional aspect of it. And you kind of have to do that. Otherwise, you end up like Neil deGrasse Tyson, where you're going to start sidestepping, deflecting, engaging in whataboutism, and it just makes you look really, really bad. And now one has to question all of the science that you've ever done in your life, and I don't want that for myself. At the end of the day, we're all human. We're all fully capable of human errors, right? So for Tyson, it's his own arrogance and his refusal to come off his high horse and admit that he's wrong. And we've seen that in politicians, in anyone who wields a lot of influence and power. We see this even with a person like Dave Smith. He is weak to his wife. And I don't know if he has a daughter, but I am sure that when he gets into an argument with his daughter, he will always lose, right? Because that's just the way he's wired, right? And so everything is subjective. You do with it what you will. But if things keep coming up, right? Oh, why are we arguing about this again? You'll know why, because you didn't take care of it before with logic and with reason. Okay. And so with me, less so, but at the same time, allowing the appropriate emotions to manifest at the appropriate time, to me, I think is a much less volatile way of living life. And you should give it a try, see how that works. It's very different, but you don't have a lot of the fighting and arguing that a lot of other people seem to struggle with year after year. Anyway, that's it for Black Friday 2024. I'll talk to you guys next week. Have a good weekend.